Hi Class 6, this is Ms. White here to introduce you to ecology, which is our next unit. And as you're watching this lecture, you should be filling out the notes that go along with it. They are in Eco 1, and it's electronic. It's on the curriculum page. And so we're going to start by defining the word ecology. And you should write this into your notes under key terms. It's term number 8. And so the formal definition of ecology is it's the study of how living things interact with each other and with their environment. And here's the flow of ideas for the ecology unit in general. We'll start with section 1.1 in your textbook, which is living things in the environment, and that's what this lecture covers. 1.2 is studying populations. 1.3 is interactions among living things. And then if we have time, we will go into chapter 2, which talks about energy flow in ecosystems and cycles of matter. And of course, as we've talked about already, we have some major projects coming up. The first is the cicada tracker, which you've been working on in technology. And as soon as we get those sensors up and running, we'll go out and at least take a couple of data samples there. And then the second project is the effect of environmental variables on plant growth. 3 main ideas in this section. What needs are met by an organism's environment? What are the 2 parts of an organism's habitat with which it interacts? And what are the levels of organization within an ecosystem? Your key terms, there's many of them, and you're going to fill them in as you go. Habitat, biotic factor, abiotic factor, species, population, community, ecosystem, ecology. And we already saw ecology on the front slide, so you may have to go back and fill that in if you missed it. Okay, we're going to open the lecture with a picture of the prairie. So if any of you have been out to Kansas or Nebraska, even a little bit of Iowa, and those states in the Midwest, you have seen the prairie, and it's these vast, expansive grasslands. And so this painting shows a typical prairie scene. And particularly, this is meant to represent the prairie dog habitat. And so these little guys right here are cute little prairie dogs. And what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and in your notes list all the living and non-living things you see in this painting. So take about a minute to do this right now. Okay, let's identify some of the living and non-living things. So we'll start with living. We start up at the top here. We have some bison. This type of deer out here. An eagle, owls. I think this is a badger and a ferret, a coyote. All the prairie dogs here. Different type of bird, rabbits, a snake. And then various insects in here. And then don't forget that there are also plants, and they are living things as well. So all of these types of grasses that the prairie is well known for are living things as well. Non-living things include the soil, sunlight, the air, which contains oxygen, which as you know is important for life, temperature. You may have seen some other ones. That's a good start. And so this gets us to the idea of a habitat. And I'm sure you've heard the word before, but the formal definition is that it's an environment that provides the things that an organism needs to live, grow, and reproduce. So this picture that we were just looking at represents the prairie dog's habitat, and the habitat for all these other organisms as well. And so the prairie dog and other organisms, in order to live, they need, at the very basic level, food, water, and shelter. And so the habitat is going to provide those things for it. And another important idea is that each organism has a specific habitat that it calls home. So what is one organism's habitat may not be the habitat of the other organism. And as you can imagine, a living thing interacts with both the living and the non-living parts of its habitat. And as scientists, we have special terms for each of those. The biotic factors are what we call the living parts of the environment. So if I say biotic factor, you know I'm referring to a plant or an animal of some sort, or some interaction between a plant and an animal, or an animal, or a plant and a plant. And then abiotic factors are the non-living parts of the environment. And so we're going to give you some practice with these terms. We'll go back to the painting, and I'd like you to identify in your notes 3 biotic factors shown in this scene and 3 abiotic factors shown in this painting. Take a moment to do that now. Okay, so for biotic factors, again, that's going to be any living thing that's in the habitat. So any of these animals that we just talked about, any of the grasses we talked about, those will be biotic factors. And then any interaction that these living things are having is an example of a biotic factor. So let me give you one specific example. This eagle is cruising around looking for prey of some sort. So predation, or a predator eating another organism, is an example of a biotic factor as well, because it involves interactions between the living parts of the environment. The abiotic factors, again, are those non-living parts of the environment that we already identified. So things like soil, temperature, sunlight. We talk about moisture. What was the other one we mentioned? Oh, oxygen, right? So all those things are very important in the environment as well, but they are all non-living. There's nothing alive about any of those things. Okay, next concept we're going to talk about is the levels of ecological organization. So ecologists, they like to organize what they study into these hierarchical levels. And so we start at the bottom with the organism. And that is simply a single living thing. So this deer is an organism, a prairie dog is an organism, you are an organism, a single bacterial cell is an organism, a mushroom is an organism, all these things, single living thing. Now we climb up the levels and we go to population. And we've been talking about this term a bit with evolution, and just as a refresher, a population is all the members of one species living in an area. So for example, a population here is all of these deer that live in this particular field. Now if there were another population of these deer living maybe on the other side of the mountain, then that's a different population, because it has to be all the members of one species living in a fairly contained area. And of course it's only a single species, so you cannot mix, say, the deer and the rabbits and call that a population. That would be 2 populations, the rabbit population and the deer. Next level up is the community, and a community is all the different populations living together in an area. So if we look at this picture, we see that we have the deer population, it's over here, and then we can imagine having a chipmunk population. There's probably more of this guy around. The horse and the human, and then way off in the distance you can see looks like some bison or cattle. So that's another population. The birds, the butterflies, all those populations put together living in a common area is what we refer to as a community. And then finally, we have the ecosystem. And this word right here, where it says population, I'm circling it. It should say ecosystem, so that's a typo, but it's over here as well. See it? Ecosystem. And an ecosystem includes the community of organisms living in a particular area plus all of their non-living surroundings. So it's plus all those abiotic factors living in the environment. So if we look at the picture, now we've zoomed out a bit, and you can see all those small populations of organisms, and they together represent the community. But now, if we zoom out even further, we're talking about the sunlight and the mountains and the soil and all those things. But don't be confused and say, ooh, the grass and the trees are the abiotic factors in this environment, because remember, the grass and the trees are actually organisms. They're living things. So we would include them within the biotic part of the community, the living part. Back to this painting again. What I'd like you to do in your notes is to identify an organism, a population, a community, and an ecosystem for this painting. And there can be multiple right answers for everything but community and ecosystem. So there are many different types of organisms in here, for example. So take a minute and identify those things for me. Okay. So for organism, that's a single living thing. You could have said many, many different things. You could have talked about this prairie dog, or this bison, or this bird, or this spider, or this plant, or this grass, or this snake, or coyote, etc. You get the drift. Remember that the plants are living things too. They are not part of the abiotic or non-living environment. They are living. Okay, population. Again, you could have said many things. You could talk about the prairie dog population, which would be all these guys here that I'm circling. So it's all the members of that same species living in this part of the prairie. You talk about the rabbit population, so it's all the rabbits living in this area, all the ants living in this area, all the grass in this area. That'd be the grass population. The community is then all those populations taken together. So it's the prairie dog population plus the rabbit population plus the badger population plus the bison population plus the grass population in this part of the prairie. So everything's still the living parts of the habitat. We're not talking about the abiotic parts. Those come in when we get to the ecosystem level. So in this prairie ecosystem, we are considering all the communities of living organisms here that we just identified, plus all those non-living parts of the environment, the soil, temperature, sunlight, oxygen, moisture, etc. And just as a tip, if you're trying to remember the difference between biotic and abiotic, the word or the root bio, B-I-O, comes from Greek meaning life. Greek and Latin roots, actually. When you put in the letter A before a word, so abiotic, that A means not or none. So if it's abiotic, then it means not living, literally. Okay, so whenever you see an A in front of things, generally it means not, at least in a scientific context. Okay, last example. You're going to test your knowledge. We're in a new ecosystem now, a new habitat for these organisms. We're at the edge of a pond, and it's very, very green and beautiful, and there's lots of different organisms floating around here. So I'd like you to identify as many abiotic factors as you can see, as many biotic factors, and then to name an organism, a population, a community, and an ecosystem. So what you can do now in the video is pause and then take as long as you need to do this part, and then you can unpause it. Okay, so you've taken the time you need. Abiotic factors, what do we see? So abiotic, the A means not, and then bio means living, so not living. We could talk about the soil that's underneath here. We could talk about this stump of a tree, this log. It is no longer living. It was once part of a tree that was living, but now it's not. We could talk about the sunlight. There's a temperature here that we can't feel, but we can assume. The air, so how much oxygen's in here, how much oxygen's in the water, the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, how much salt is in there. We could talk about the turbidity or the cloudiness of the water. And you could probably think of some other abiotic factors as well. That's a good start. Biotic factors, anything living in here, flowers, grass, cattails, lily pads, turtles, fish, dragonflies, ladybugs, a deer, a bird, a raccoon, a frog, a water strider. Am I missing anything? Oh, the trees. Okay? Ferns. So all these things are biotic factors. And then you can talk about any interaction that they're having. So is there any predation going on? Is this fish going to eat these little fish? Or are these two turtles competing for the same spot on a log? Competition. We're going to talk about some of these interactions between living things in the next section, but this is just a preview of that. An organism. You can name an organism. Anything we just named was an organism. And don't forget, these trees and grass and plants are organisms as well. A population. We could talk about the population of fish in this habitat. We could talk about population of frogs or raccoons or deer, the turtle population. Okay. A community, well, the community here is all of these populations of organisms taken together. And then finally, the ecosystem is all the populations, so it's the community, which is the living part of the environment, plus those abiotic factors we mentioned earlier. Okay, that is the end of section 1.1. There's not too much information in there. You know, as a review, we talked about the concept of a habitat and how it's an environment that provides all the things a living organism needs. We talked about abiotic and biotic factors, right, that living and non-living parts of the environment. And we talked about levels of ecological organization, starting with the organism, going to the population, community, and then ecosystem. And so I've listed 6 questions here, and they are at the bottom of your notes. They're the review questions. I'd like you to complete these for homework, and you can type in your answers right into your document. And this will help you determine whether you understand this material or not. And we will go over it in class, so you can ask any questions you have at that point. Okay, thank you for listening.